Situation in Pennsylvania, they have not kept pace with the pollution reductions that they needed to achieve, so they're behind in reducing nutrients and sediment. And they're a big part of the flow to the Chesapeake. So 50% of Pennsylvania drains to the Chesapeake Bay, and 50% of the freshwater flow comes from the Susquehanna. So it has a significant impact on the environment. And with respect to the Conowingo Dam, it's basically served as a large management practice over the years. There are two other dams upstream of the Conowingo that have already filled in. And when EPA and the states, the 6 states and the District of Columbia within the watershed, issued the total maximum daily load, it was already anticipated that the Conowingo Dam would fill up behind the dam with sediment. And so, anticipating that, I think they were looking at sometime after 2025 where they would have to deal with that. Things turned out that the infill behind the dam occurred more quickly than anticipated. But to kind of put it in perspective, talking about nitrogen specifically, we're attempting to achieve a 192 million pound reduction in nitrogen discharges to the watershed and ultimately to the bay. The Conowingo Dam represents an additional 6 million pounds, so 6 million out of 192. I know there are a lot of people who are concerned about the sediment and the impact of the sediment on the Susquehanna Flats and on shellfishing. And that's a real concern, there's no question about that. But this is a manageable problem. I think it's been characterized by some as, well, we shouldn't do anything until we've figured out what to do with Conowingo Dam, because that's going to, just blow everything out of the water. And if we had a hurricane like we did in 1972, Hurricane Agnes, we'd have even more problems than sediments topping the dam. In 72, it totally destroyed the Susquehanna Flats bay grasses. And a storm of that magnitude, you've got a lot of other environmental impacts to worry about other than sediment loading to the lower portion of the Susquehanna. It is a manageable issue, and the states just recently agreed to form a separate watershed implementation plan just for the Conowingo Dam. And there is an expectation that Exelon will be part of the discussions. The state of Maryland has issued what they call a 401 water quality certification, which says basically you're going to have to be at the table and help deal with this problem. Exelon has challenged that. They've appealed that decision, and in a couple of different forms, so that'll work its way through the legal and administrative system to get resolved. To their credit, they've already paid for a lot of additional monitoring, water quality monitoring and modeling to show what the impacts are. The firm that did that work was independent from Exelon. Exelon paid for it, but they didn't actually choose them. It was approved by the states to go ahead and use them. So it's an independent, objective look at the information. When you look at water quality specifically, it makes a 3% difference in dissolved oxygen in the deep channel of the bay. So from a water quality point of view, the impact is not huge. I think there's more concern about how the sediments actually impact shellfishing. And again, I think there are other approaches that are more cost-effective in dealing with the sediments that are currently overtopping the dam. Well, when you look at the cost of dredging, if you were to take that same amount of funding and apply it to best management practices that would be implemented up into the watershed, you could achieve much greater reductions. So from a cost-benefit point of view, taking that, you could spend a lot less money putting practices in Pennsylvania and New York, and you could get greater reductions. So spending a lot of money on dredging, it's not only a matter of the cost of dredging, but you also have to take into account what are you going to do with it once you've dredged it. You have to put it somewhere. And there is some capacity in old quarries along the river, but again, it's an additional cost to get the dredge spoil there, and then managing it. The Hogan administration in Maryland has initiated a study to see what kinds of options are out there. I've been in this business for 35 years, and dredge has been talked about for that entire time, and nobody has come up with a good, cost-effective way to deal with dredge spoil. Pennsylvania has not achieved the reductions that it was required to under the total maximum daily load. There's just no question about that. And they need to pick up the pace. They need to implement more best management practices, and they need to reduce flows of nutrients and sediment to the watershed. And it's not just about the bay. I mean, the water quality standards are established for the bay, and that's how the TMDL was structured. But in many cases in Pennsylvania and New York, they have impaired waterways that they need to fix for their own citizens. So it's not we're doing this for everybody downstream, it's we're doing this because we need to for our own people. And I think there's a growing recognition that that they need to make these investments. They don't even have to think about the bay necessarily, but they need to make these investments to protect their own resources.
Why is Pennsylvania doing more? Why aren't you? You must have some.
It's I would describe it as a very difficult and paralyzing political situation. There's a very conservative General Assembly. And regardless of the party of the governor, whether they're Republican or Democrat, it seems that the General Assembly has not seen fit to make the investments that are necessary. They're the ones that approve the budget, and they haven't made the investments that are necessary to achieve water quality standards, either for the bay or for their own waterways. You know, there's a history of mining and oil and gas exploration, production up there, which has impacted the state significantly. Now with Marcellus shale gas, again, we're seeing resource extraction without there being any compensation for that. And I think the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania would be wise to look at that resource and to at least require companies that are taking those resources out of the ground to mitigate the impacts and to compensate the state for having to restore that environment. You know, there have been some attempts to put in extraction taxes. I think that's one good way of doing it. Also, establishing stormwater utilities where fees are charged based on impervious surface. They also need to make greater investments in agriculture, and agriculture is the biggest source of nutrients and sediments, and they have a lot of farms, and many of them are small farms, and they've had a difficult time actually enforcing the laws that they have on the books. They simply don't have the staff to go out and conduct inspections to make sure that the farms are in compliance with their own state laws. It wouldn't surprise me at some point if there wasn't a lawsuit filed against Pennsylvania for failing to do what they need to do to stem pollution that's having an impact downstream. But they should be doing it to protect their own citizens, first and foremost. Yeah, I think we might need to kind of change the terminology, and you know, instead of talking generally about the environment, what we ought to do is talk about drinking water. What we ought to talk about is diseases that result from air pollution. We're seeing an effort in Washington right now to roll back a lot of environmental regulations that are really health-based. And it concerns me that not only is the environment going to be degraded, but we're also going to see significant health effects from the deregulation of a lot of these programs. You know, asbestos was recently on the table to relax standards for that. The CAFE standards, the corporate average fleet exhaust emission standards. So now cars could be allowed to pollute more. I hope that our industry, who basically agreed to the standards that were established under the previous administration, they were more than ready to adopt those standards, will say we're going to do it anyway. You know, this is the right thing to do. We want to reduce the health impacts that are associated with vehicle emissions, and the technology is there, and we need to set the pace for the rest of the globe. You know, and it is a global issue. In the case of mercury, for example, a portion of the mercury that comes from power plants and other combustion sources, about 50% of it actually comes from outside of the U.S. So we could control whatever emissions we have of mercury, but if the rest of the world isn't doing it, then we're going to suffer from the deposition of mercury from these other sources. Same with climate change. It has to be a global effort. If we don't do something, then it's sure to happen. If we do something, whether that's buying a car that, you know, like an electric car, or recycling, or whatever the case may be, changing the way we grow food. If we don't do those things, then we're absolutely assured to have these impacts happen. And they're not going to be pleasant. They're going to be extremely devastating. And we're already seeing, you know, millions of people affected by these severe storms, much more frequent than they used to be. And most of the world's population, and that's true in the United States, lives along the coast because people like to live by water. And those are the areas that are going to be affected. And we're going to see, probably in our remaining lifetime, the beginning of mass relocations of populations. And that's not going to be a pretty thing. And it's going to be extremely difficult and extremely expensive. And it would be better if we actually prepared for that and started doing it in a very planned way. But that's not the way humans, you know, respond. They wait until there's a catastrophe, and then, you know, everybody rushes to do the right thing. You know, we're destroying the nest that we're living in, basically. And figure it out.